There are restless minds struggling to sleep, haunted by something nameless pressing against the edge of their awareness. They jolt awake, gripped by an unease they can't explain, as if something ancient and unstoppable is drawing near. And what they haven't yet realized is this: the presence that shadows their peace, the storm forming just outside their emotional reach, it carries your imprint. Not the former version they dismissed, not the one they thought would never return, but the version reborn when every path collapsed, when surrender was no longer an option, and all that remained was to become a force that doesn't fit into any known category. Your evolution has started triggering alarm systems in people who never even knew your name. There's a quiet tension in rooms where your influence is felt but not mentioned. Pauses in conversation, sudden unease, sideways glances when your path is referenced without context. They're inventing careful phrases to tiptoe around what you've become, hoping the mere mention won't attract the aftermath of what you've stepped into. But what they don't yet see is that the change they're trying to tiptoe around isn't coming. It's already here, and it's already beyond their reach to decode, contain, or reverse. Somewhere far beyond the reach of their explanations and belief systems, an invisible protocol has been tallying what they once dismissed as irrelevant. Not with emotion, not with vengeance, just precision. Every underhanded word thrown your way, every door closed without cause, every smirk shared when you were at your lowest, none of it disappeared into the air like they assumed. It went somewhere. It meant something. And now, what was once invisible is starting to take shape in undeniable, tangible ways. Not because you asked for revenge, but because the balance of energy always demands it. While they believed they were rewriting your story in pencil, something greater was engraving theirs in stone. Not because you're vindictive, but because truth has a memory longer than silence. The pattern they thought would trap you is now folding in on itself. Every single move they made against you has been returned to sender, not out of rage, but through the quiet correction of divine rhythm. No courtroom, no audience, no appeal. Just justice, arriving quietly, with receipts. And just before the evidence arrived, something subtle began shifting in the air around you. There was no announcement, no glowing sign, no trumpet, but the atmosphere changed. Not with noise, but with tension. They began avoiding eye contact, laughing too quickly, cutting off their own sentences when you walked in. It wasn't fear in the traditional sense, it was confusion. Their minds couldn't place what felt different, but their spirits could feel what had risen in you. Something sacred had realigned itself, and their energy knew it before they did. That discomfort in their posture, the clumsy jokes, the urgent glances at their screens, it wasn't about you fitting in anymore. It was about them realizing, consciously or not, that your presence no longer operated within their ecosystem. You weren't reacting. You weren't explaining. You weren't lowering your tone to make others feel tall. Something had clicked in you, a quiet separation. And though they couldn't name it, every part of them responded to it. The frequencies no longer matched. You had changed, and the room knew it before you said a word. It didn't arrive like thunder. There was no announcement, no fanfare, only quiet, deliberate acts of self-respect. Like when the pressure to defend your truth finally collapsed under the weight of your own peace. Or the first time guilt tried to grip your shoulders and found no place to land. Or that afternoon when the loneliness of solitude felt lighter than the suffocation of forced belonging. These weren't dramatic choices. They were small, defiant rejections of who you were taught to be. And that's exactly what made them irreversible. In their arrogance, those who opposed you read your quiet as a final page. They mistook your absence from the chaos as proof of your retreat. While they whispered triumphs in each other's ears, you were reshaping the battlefield, out of sight, beyond reach. They never considered that you were recalibrating. Not defeated. Just done with games that were always beneath you. And when the consequences arrive, they won't recognize the cause. But you will. Because the price of that awakening was yours alone to carry. The first soul to truly notice wasn't part of your past. It was someone unburdened by your history. No memories to cloud their vision. They encountered your presence like a shift in gravity, undeniable but hard to describe. They didn't fear you, but something in them paused, as if recognizing a signal that hadn't yet reached the surface. They sensed the internal realignment long before you could even name it. And in their gaze, you finally caught a glimpse of who you were becoming, unfiltered by the weight of your former roles. But revelation has a cost. As your eyes adjusted to this new clarity, the shadows behind old smiles grew darker. Hidden patterns rose to the surface, and masks fell with a kind of brutal honesty. The trust you gave freely had been used in transactions where your worth was weighed without your knowledge. The warmth you mistook for loyalty came with quiet demands, invisible strings, and emotional debts no one warned you about. Waking up to truth felt less like sunrise and more like stepping barefoot onto shattered illusions. While they were busy crafting their conclusions about your silence, something sacred was unraveling inside you. Not collapse, but recalibration. Deep-rooted patterns that had shaped your bloodline like iron bars were beginning to crack. Conditioned roles, inherited limitations, and stories passed off as just how we are began slipping from your grip. And every time you chose to respond differently, to stop repeating what hurt you, a quiet explosion echoed through your lineage. Not destruction, disruption. You didn't just bend the rules of your upbringing. You broke them wide open. This path was never about self-care alone. Every internal shift you made was rewriting the energetic imprint of your entire ancestral timeline. Each time you walked away from control disguised as love, or refused to mirror the pain that raised you, you pulled threads from a web older than your body. And the impact reached both directions, healing what preceded you, and purifying what will follow. What looked like rebellion from the outside was actually restoration in its highest form. But restoration makes people uncomfortable when they've built comfort out of chaos. The resistance came wrapped in familiar faces. People who should have championed your healing were suddenly triggered by your transformation. Those still operating within inherited dysfunction felt the pressure of your progress like a mirror they never asked to hold. You weren't arguing. You were simply behaving differently. But even that was too much. The system had grown used to its cycles. And the one who stops spinning becomes the one who threatens its very survival. They couldn't celebrate your growth, because your evolution was evidence that their excuses were optional. And so the fiercest opposition didn't come from the outside world. It came from within the circle that taught you who to be. Your new boundaries disrupted roles they'd learned to depend on. Your peace interrupted their patterns. Your refusal to pretend anymore stripped away the layers they weren't ready to face. And in their fear, some turned on you. Not because you harmed them, but because you showed them what freedom looks like, and they weren't ready to want it for themselves. They expected your healing to be slow, hesitant, maybe even apologetic. But instead, it became a silent revolt, one that exposed everything they were avoiding. You stopped shrinking to fit stories that weren't yours. You stopped breaking yourself just to keep broken things together. And when you chose to move forward without needing anyone to understand, you became something they couldn't define anymore. You didn't turn bitter. You turned precise. And your clarity became a threat to their comfort. The distance they thought would destroy you only refined your senses. You began catching the hidden motives behind soft smiles, detecting the spin behind well-rehearsed sympathy, noticing the emptiness behind flattery that once fooled you. That forced separation. It gave you what no crowded room ever could: space to hear your own truth without interruption. While they laughed at your silence, you were learning to listen deeper. And in that stillness, the fog cleared. Every night they imagined you wrestling with loneliness. You were instead building an inner landscape no storm could touch. What looked like isolation from the outside was really a return to wholeness. No more chasing spaces that diluted your worth. No more echoing your voice just to be included. You chose calm over chaos, intention over acceptance, and depth over popularity. That wasn't abandonment. That was alignment. And in that alignment, you tapped into something ancient and unshakable. They never considered the possibility that being cast out would actually set you free. That the doors they closed were only cages disguised as community. While they played games of approval and alliance, you stopped playing altogether. You outgrew the script. And what they couldn't grasp was that you were never seeking power over them. You were seeking peace from within. They maintained connection through performance. You built connection through presence. And one of those was always going to last longer. The real shift came when you no longer needed to be seen to feel valid. When you no longer sought belonging in places that demanded you forget who you were. You realized that being left out was never the punishment, it was the portal. And on the other side of that solitude, you found clarity, depth, and purpose that no crowd could have given you. That's what made you powerful. Not revenge, not attention, but the decision to keep building, even when no one was watching. There was something happening behind the curtain of your awareness, quietly, steadily, without applause. You weren't just recovering, you were unlocking a deeper language hidden beneath experience. With time, you stopped needing permission to trust your gut. Patterns began revealing themselves in the tone of a greeting, in the pause before someone spoke, in the way certain eyes flickered when truth got too close. The world hadn't changed. You had tuned in. You weren't reading minds. You were just finally reading the signs they never thought you'd notice. But clarity like that doesn't arrive without consequence. The moment your awareness outgrew their tricks, their masks stopped fitting. Those who once manipulated the narrative found themselves frozen in front of someone who no longer reacted on cue. You didn't raise your voice, you just stopped playing dumb. They had planned for the version of you that needed validation, not the one that studied every angle and moved without broadcasting intent. You weren't just harder to fool, you'd become impossible to categorize. They worked hard to break what they didn't understand. And while they wasted their breath on trying to dismantle your name, you were busy rewiring the very core of how you processed the world. Pain didn't harden you, it sharpened you. The betrayals that could have collapsed you only redirected your trajectory. Each goodbye that stung in the moment became a checkpoint on your way to spaces they never even imagined existed. They thought they were removing you from the game. But really, they were clearing your path. Your internal world began processing life differently, at speeds and depths that confused the people around you. What felt like rejection to them felt like alignment to you. What they called isolation, you recognized as expansion. Where they aimed to shame you into silence, you found the kind of peace that doesn't require noise. The foundation they assumed would crack beneath you revealed itself to be unshakable. Because once you stopped needing their echo, you finally hear your own voice. And that voice, it carries truth they still can't face. You're not the threat because you're angry. You're the threat because you're awake. There was a shift in the way your mind processed everything. When the outside noise fell away, when the endless need to adjust and appease disappeared, something inside you locked into place. Your thoughts grew sharper. Your vision turned inward and deeper. Without having to juggle everyone else's emotional weight, your mind started drawing connections others missed. You weren't trying to be smarter. You were simply no longer distracted. And that clarity gave you access to a realm of insight they didn't even know existed. But clarity isn't always celebrated. It made you unsettling to those still addicted to confusion. Your presence began unraveling the stories they'd built their identity around. While they chased status in places that drained them, you found calm in spaces they dismissed. Your stillness became louder than their performance. And without saying anything, you became proof that contentment isn't bought, it's chosen. You weren't seeking attention. But the way you existed without it made them question everything they thought they wanted. This shift didn't end with peace, it evolved into disruption. The version of you they used to manage no longer existed. You weren't breaking down. You were dismantling the outdated structure of your old life. And in the middle of that rebuild, something irreversible occurred. There was no fanfare, no dramatic exit, just a quiet moment when the internal pressure reached its limit, and you clicked into place. Like a lock finally finding the right combination. Painful, yes, but also precise. Nothing fell apart. Everything realigned. When you opened your eyes the next day, the atmosphere was the same, but you were not. The urge to explain yourself had vanished. The need to fix what wasn't yours to carry dissolved. The part of you that once hoped they'd understand had surrendered, not from defeat, but from freedom. You no longer needed their comprehension to validate your direction. It wasn't detachment. It was inner knowing so rooted that even chaos couldn't shake it. That moment wasn't the end of anything. It was the beginning of everything they didn't prepare for. Something inside you recalibrated at a level that can't be measured in words. It was like your entire internal code, every setting, every instinct, was rewritten in silence. You didn't change for attention. You changed because something deeper demanded it. And now, without saying a word, the atmosphere around you reacts. People glance at you with curiosity they can't explain. It's not about your appearance. It's about the current you carry, one they can't name, but instantly feel. The shift didn't come from effort. It came from alignment. While others remained occupied with surface-level strategy, you were tuning into the engine behind the scenes. You stopped asking for outcomes and started understanding how outcomes are shaped. Your stillness wasn't withdrawal. It was dialogue with the unseen. Not wishful thinking. Not blind belief. But a growing fluency with the system that governs cause and effect. While they refined tactics, you cultivated alignment. While they tried to persuade people, you started communicating with purpose itself. Eventually, it became clear that truth isn't just a belief, it's a presence. And the moment you dropped the costumes meant to keep others comfortable, something powerful began happening. Your energy no longer bent to the room. It shifted the room. You didn't need to call anyone out. Just by standing fully in yourself, you made avoidance impossible. People started facing their own contradictions, not because you exposed them, but because your transparency left nowhere to hide. This wasn't some calculated strategy. It was the inevitable result of choosing what's real again and again until it became effortless. And when that happened, your presence began lighting up the unresolved within others. You didn't try to trigger them. They triggered themselves in your reflection. Their nervous laughter, their sudden distance, their defensive explanations. It wasn't personal. It was energetic. You had become the reminder of what they gave up, and the proof that reclaiming it is still possible. You didn't do it to prove anything. You did it to feel whole. But wholeness has a strange side effect. It shakes everything false around it. And now, whether they're ready or not, your very existence is asking one quiet, powerful question. What would happen if they stopped pretending too? The shift didn't start with conflict. It started with honesty. Not the kind spoken out loud, but the kind lived without apology. And in that energy, something unspoken began happening. People who once seemed comfortable around you began to flinch in your presence. Not because you changed the subject, but because your very presence shifted the temperature. It wasn't discomfort with you, it was confrontation with themselves. You had become a walking invitation to the truth they spent years avoiding. There was no campaign, no rebellion, just a quiet refusal to play the part anymore. And that was enough. In rooms where deception once echoed freely, your calm became an amplifier. Those who once manipulated dynamics with ease suddenly found their tricks falling flat. You weren't challenging them. You just weren't feeding them. Without needing approval, without seeking favor, you became immune to the tactics that once held power over you. As for those who worked behind the curtain, those who spun quiet schemes and smiled with hidden knives, they began noticing a shift they couldn't explain. Misfortunes appeared where things used to fall into place. Plans unraveled at the seams, support systems quietly dissolved, and the air around them grew heavy with a pressure they couldn't identify. No one pointed fingers. Yet everything felt like fallout. And the one they thought they buried was nowhere near the ground. What they failed to understand was that this wasn't about punishment, it was about alignment. The energy they poured into breaking what was never theirs to control had completed its loop. The force they released was returning, not to harm, but to rebalance. They believed in timing when it worked in their favor. But now they were witnessing a different rhythm, the kind that waits patiently, then arrives without warning. A silent correction woven into the fabric of everything. And in the middle of it all, you stood unshaken. Not out of vengeance, but out of clarity. Because when you no longer resist who you are, reality bends around that truth. And everyone who once misunderstood you must now come to terms with what they couldn't destroy. Your presence, your peace, your power. They thought they chose wisely. They traded truth for comfort, loyalty for convenience, and silence for approval. And now, they're waking up in spaces they once idolized, feeling smaller than ever. The faces around them smile wide, but say nothing real. They got the invitation, got the seat, got the nod, but lost themselves on the way. They reached the summit of a mountain that never mattered, and now they're haunted by the echo of what they abandoned to get there. What shocked them most wasn't your growth. It was your stillness. They expected to hear your outrage in the distance, feel your need to explain, witness your longing to be understood. But none of that came. Instead, there was only silence. Not the silence of defeat, but the silence of detachment. You didn't disappear. You simply disconnected. And for them, that void became louder than any revenge ever could have been. They expected a reaction. What they got was release. You'd stopped needing their reflection to validate your existence. You weren't looking for closure, for redemption, or even acknowledgement. What they didn't see coming was the moment you realized they were never the source of your worth to begin with. And when you stepped outside the story they tried to write for you, everything they thought they understood about power unraveled at its core. It was never about proving yourself, it was about remembering what couldn't be taken. And once that memory returned, you saw it all differently. Those betrayals weren't setbacks. They were selections. Each moment of abandonment was the universe clearing your path with surgical precision. What felt like loss was actually a release. What looked like unfairness was exact calibration. None of it random. All of it necessary. You weren't being discarded. You were being prepared. Not for revenge, but for recognition. The painful chapters weren't punishments. They were blueprints. Every disappointment shaped a new part of your resilience. Every departure revealed a hidden gate. And now, as they sit surrounded by everything they once prioritized over you, they're left to face the quiet, undeniable truth. You were never the problem. You were the proof. They assumed they were dismantling you with every attack. But what they didn't realize was that the more they pushed, the faster they disappeared from the equation. Their interference didn't interrupt your path. It illuminated it. Every time they tried to disrupt your movement, they wrote themselves out of your story. They weren't authoring your end. They were accelerating their own irrelevance. What looked like sabotage was really self-erasure. And the silence that followed, that was evolution. The very resistance they offered was part of a larger orchestration they couldn't comprehend. Their efforts to destabilize you were actually working in service of your acceleration. They believed they were stalling you. In truth, they were activating the pressure needed to unlock the next phase. Every betrayal, every barrier, every shadow they cast only sharpened your direction. Not through punishment, but through precision. They became instruments in a composition they weren't qualified to interpret. Their disdain became the catalyst. Their exclusion became the portal. Every wound became a signal flare, alerting the deeper parts of your being to awaken, adapt, and ascend. They gave you every reason to fold. And in doing so, They stripped away every illusion that was never yours to begin with. You weren't chasing light. You were becoming the kind that reveals what others are afraid to see. And when they finally looked closely, they didn't find a victim. They found themselves, reflected through the very consequence they created. They tried to outshine you, not realizing you had stopped competing long ago. They built strategies to win a game you were no longer playing. And while they clung to hierarchy, to control, to validation, you were constructing something entirely outside their reach. Their tools couldn't touch it. Their tactics couldn't distort it. They were rehearsing for a battle you'd already transcended. And what terrified them most wasn't your resistance, it was your exit from their system altogether. They now watch from the sidelines, grasping at shadows of influence that no longer matter. And as they hold onto illusions, you are shaping realities beyond their field of vision. Their relevance belonged to a version of you that no longer exists. And while they're still cycling through outdated moves, you've become the one thing they never accounted for: unreachable. This wasn't a transformation born from addition. It was a deep, almost surgical release of everything that distorted your original frequency. What others called your identity had been downloaded from expectations, assumptions, and survival roles. But something in you refused to keep carrying what never came from your own truth. And over time, those false codes were cleared, one by one. You weren't learning who to become. You were remembering who you never stopped being. That's why they couldn't understand it. Their idea of power was still tied to quantity. How much you own, how many follow you, how often you're seen. But you weren't collecting. You were simplifying. You didn't want more. You wanted real. And real doesn't require permission. Real doesn't beg for attention. While they chased applause, you were finding the kind of authority that doesn't speak loudly, but shifts rooms simply by existing. Their attempts to break you only refined your ability to reshape what they threw. You turned their projections into wisdom, their insults into insight. What was meant to sabotage became signal. Where they hoped to see a collapse, you forged clarity. Not because you wanted revenge, but because you couldn't be moved by lies anymore. Your spirit didn't just survive the opposition. It evolved because of it. Every rejection was rerouting. Every no was a door closed for your protection. You no longer viewed obstacles as enemies, but as architects shaping a path they themselves couldn't walk. And while they celebrated your absence, thinking it was a sign of defeat, they didn't realize you were clearing space for the kind of presence that doesn't need to fight for a seat because it creates the table. And something else began shifting too. The people around you. One by one, the echoes fell silent. Familiar faces drifted, not from malice, but misalignment. And as they left, new ones arrived. Not loud, not demanding, but present. Strangers who recognized something sacred in you, long before you saw it yourself. People who didn't just meet your energy, they respected it. You didn't rebuild your circle based on comfort. You rebuilt it based on truth. These weren't relationships born from shared wounds or desperate convenience. They were grounded in mutual growth, unspoken integrity, and silent knowing. These weren't people who needed to be convinced. They simply showed up and stayed. Not because it was easy, but because it was real. What's been unfolding inside you was never just personal growth. It became a kind of resonance. Wherever you went, the energy began to shift. Not because you were trying to lead, but because you refused to follow anything false. Your presence made pretense too heavy to carry. People found themselves thinking differently, feeling exposed without knowing why. You didn't offer advice. You just stood there as living evidence of what happens when someone finally sheds everything they're not. That impact is exactly what rattled the system. It's not your escape that threatened them, it's the idea that others might follow. They were never afraid of one person waking up. They were afraid of the chain reaction. They built their world on the illusion that captivity was normal. And now you're walking around free, and it's making everyone question the bars they thought were permanent. Not because you said anything, but because you stopped apologizing for being free. What they used to weaponize against others doesn't work on you anymore. You've outgrown the triggers, the guilt tactics, the silent punishments. They can't shame you into submission when you no longer measure yourself by their rules. They can't hook you with jealousy when your joy isn't tied to status. Every tool they once used to keep people in line now slides off you like water on stone. And worse, others are starting to notice it too.